So the Cold War is this is going to be kind of like the World War II one, where it's going to be pretty fast. Largely because I'm going to focus in on some of the conflicts, just to kind of make sure you have kind of a context for what's happening. I'm not really going to, we'll talk about the role of women kind of separately, if you will, when we talk about things like the feminist movement and that sort of thing. So this is really just kind of context. So it's going to move pretty quick. And a lot of this is kind of the sort of thing that really lends itself well to, a documentary or watching, a crash course video, that kind of thing. So part of the deal with the Cold War is you have a tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this tension is political, it is ideological, it is economic. Everything is kind of tangled up, and sitting behind these economic and ideological differences is that both sides are these military superpowers, right? Both the United States and the Soviet Union were major military players in World War II. And so they are uniquely positioned to be the superpowers of the world. And so they will really be opposed to each other, working on building spheres of influence throughout Asia, Europe, Latin America, Middle East. And this will include a lot of military spending by the United States and the Soviet Union, including nuclear weapons, including the space race. And this part of the anxiety of the Cold War is going to cause people to really kind of insist upon we have to believe certain things about America, right? So this is where we add one nation under God into the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Or the under God portion. And this is where we come up with the motto, "In God We Trust." Largely to separate ourselves, we're different than the Soviet Union. Even some of the perceptions about kind of how women live and kind of middle class life, and the idea that our teenagers, are in high school and they do all these things. This is all meant to kind of contrast the American way of doing things with the Soviet way of doing things. And so there becomes, interestingly, because of this desire to create this very kind of strong American identity, there's no room for diverging opinions in the 1950s, particularly. Now, as we move into the 1960s, that will change. But lots of kind of concerns, and I called this dogmatic democracy, right? This real like strict view about how things have to be, which had not really been a part of, hadn't really existed in that format before. And so you have lots of government expansion as well during this period. And so in Europe, you have, I mentioned before that Potsdam is kind of the beginning of this tensions between Truman and Stalin, particularly over free elections in Eastern Europe and in Germany, and over the division of Germany, right? And the issues, Stalin is secretly aware of the atomic bomb, even though it's not, the United States hasn't told him about it. And so this creates a lot of tension, right? And so you've got this division of Germany into West Germany and East Germany. And so you have the Soviet Union basically insisting they don't want the United States to control everything. So they try to kind of upset things in Greece and Turkey and Iran. So the U.S. then uses the Truman Doctrine, which is money for military aid, or the Marshall Plan, which is financial investment in European countries, all to help encourage kind of democracy and capitalism. This will result in a blockade of West Berlin and the dropping of the Iron Curtain, which will really separate East Europe from West Europe. And the U.S. will begin a policy of containment. If we can just contain communism where it currently exists, then it won't spread, right? And so this becomes kind of the name of the game all throughout the Cold War, is this idea of containment, particularly in regards to Europe. Europe becomes the focal point, right? And both later on, Kennedy and then Reagan will both kind of challenge the Soviet Union on Germany, particularly Berlin, and how that works. So Europe is kind of a hot mess. Asia. China becomes communist. Part of this is, goes back to Chinese Exclusion Act and the failure of the Chinese Empire, and the U.S. in World War II really supporting nationalist Chinese that end up in Taiwan, instead of the communist Chinese, who are really the ones actively engaged in fighting Japan. And so it becomes a communist country in 1949. The U.S. kind of freaks out over that, like, oh my gosh, we let China fall to communism. How could we do that? And so we're really going to have a lot of angst over communism, especially communism in Asia, because of that. Now, I will say that Chinese communism is not just like European communism. But it has some subtle differences, and they have a tense relationship with the Soviet Union. But ultimately, as we move into the 1970s, Nixon will begin opening up trade with China, and that will begin to change things. And so this is when we start to see the trade relationship we have with China today. Korea is going to be divided. You're going to have the Soviets had kind of occupied Northern Korea. The U.S. had occupied Southern Korea. So they decide, well, let's partition it, just like they had Germany. North Korea will then invade South Korea in 1950 in order to try to unify the country. And the U.S. will encourage the United Nations Security Council to authorize a UN action to prevent that. And this will eventually lead to tensions. This will involve China, the United States. You'll have several years of conflict there. And ultimately, what you'll end up with is a ceasefire in July of 1953, leaving the current boundaries. So just kind of that's where the whole Korean thing happens. You also have problems in Vietnam. Vietnam was a French colony, had an independence movement that had been ironically inspired by Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points. And so they have become communist. And so they wanted independence from France. Well, the U.S. had not, France had not given up its colony after World War II. And the U.S. starts helping France try to hold on to their colony. Eventually, France decides it's not worth it, and they pull out. The U.S. backs a South Vietnamese government. The South Vietnamese government refuses to allow democratic elections on unification, and the U.S. will continue to send aid. And ultimately, this will create all kinds of problems and will create a longstanding U.S. presence there. A Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964 allows for a bunch of troops to go in. And so you'll have, several different problems, lots of problems with credibility. You'll have the draft. The draft will ultimately result in the creation of the 26th Amendment, giving 18-year-olds the right to vote. And lots of protests and peace movements and that kind of thing. And so then the Nixon will declare a ceasefire in 73. Troops are out by 74, and that sort of thing. So Vietnam's another place of tension. We're going to have tensions in Cuba. So think about imperialism and our actions in Cuba back then. So basically, Cuba is going to kick the United States out in 1958. And so then Fidel Castro's in charge. So from 1958 forward, the U.S. wants to get rid of Fidel. There's this plan to basically remove Castro. And when Kennedy comes in, the CIA goes to him and says, oh, hey, we've got this great idea. And this is the Bay of Pigs. And this will ultimately push Cuba into the arms of the Soviets. Soviets will start to put intercontinental ballistic missiles in Cuba, creating the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And ultimately, that'll get kind of ramped down, and you'll have the removal of the missiles from Cuba, and we'll remove missiles from Turkey. But that's kind of the origin of that conflict. Central America, so some of the problems we have with Central America today, as far as people, having really miserable lives and wanting to leave those countries, goes back to American actions in Central America. The CIA really kind of encouraged these dictatorships in places like Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Panama. And a lot of these actions are going to be kind of covert. And we'll see that, of course, you'll have an Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s because the U.S. will basically back a military dictator, all in the name of anti-communism. And that will create its own sense of problems. And then, of course, lots of drug and policy issues. So in the Middle East, you'll have the creation of Israel in 1948 by the UN. The U.S. is largely behind that. That will initially create a conflict in 1949. that the Israelis, with U.S. support, will win. There'll be an Arab-Israeli war in 1968, and the Israelis will win there, again, with American support. And it's after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, that you'll have, the Israelis occupy the West Bank, occupy territory that belonged to Palestinians. And this is going to ultimately lead to an embargo of oil by the OPEC countries, by Saudi Arabia primarily, against the U.S. for what they perceive as our backing of Israel. And so this is going to kind of be the origin of U.S. frustration with Israel, or with the Middle East, right? Kind of goes back to this. So the creation of Israel. We've got tensions with Egypt, right? We've got tensions with Iran. So that goes back to the 1950s when we helped overthrow a democratically elected leader because we thought he had communist leanings. And so we put the Shah of Iran in place. And then when they kick him out in the 1970s, they take hostages in 1979, and this creates some bad feelings between the U.S. and Iran. So this is part of that history there. Afghanistan had been actually a fairly neutral, modernizing country until the Soviet Union attacked it. The U.S. starts sending a bunch of aid to what they call the Mujahideen, which was kind of this militia force. And we send them a bunch of weapons and a bunch of military trainers, and they will eventually become the Taliban, right? But we backed them in the name of anti-communism. So lots of kind of interesting ways in which the U.S. was engaged in military action. Fundamentally, a lot of this goes back to nuclear weapons. We have them. Soviets have them. We've got mutually assured destruction. Lots of tensions, right? Now, Kennedy, by the 1960s, will start to say, well, we don't like this kind of elevated nuclear threat, the fact that people in the 50s were concerned about bomb shelters and all that kind of stuff. And so they kind of reject that involvement. And what you see is Kennedy kind of focusing on conventional military. So again, lots of anxiety, duck and cover drills, all that kind of stuff. And so nuclear weapons. Space race is another one. Starts with this launch of the satellite Sputnik in 1957. The U.S. kind of freaks out, pushes a bunch of money towards education, towards the space race, creation of NASA, the National Defense of Education Act. And then Kennedy will issue the challenge in 1961 to put a man on the moon, which will be successful in 1969. Reagan will it'll kind of slow down in the 70s. Reagan will initiate kind of this again with the space shuttle program and with his strategic defense initiative, which is probably more about propaganda to help kind of spook the Soviet Union that we could shoot down their nuclear missiles from space. Never really seems to be off the ground. It's largely kind of a theoretical defense plan, but they make a lot of noise about it, and so it kind of freaks the Soviet Union out. So the space race is a part of this Cold War. Most notably in this period is kind of the Red Scare or McCarthyism. So there was a brief Red Scare after World War I in reaction to anarchists and communism and stuff. Now you have another Red Scare, and this McCarthyism Red Scare is a little more intense. It's largely the product of the Soviets getting nuclear weapons. It's largely the product of China falling to communism. And it really kind of originates with the House Un-American Activities Committee. And, this investigation of people who have un-American behavior. And they really start going after people who maybe had affiliations with communists or socialists in the 30s, which, if you remember, that was, it wasn't a widespread thing, but it was not uncommon for people to at least kind of ask some questions about communism, right? Because the capitalist system and the Great Depression really seemed to have failed. And so there's a lot of pushback against that. And so you have people being targeted by people like Joseph McCarthy and Richard Nixon of having kind of secret communist attachments. LGBTQ people were particularly targeted because the idea was that they could be blackmailed by the Soviets. And so a lot of those people end up getting kicked out of, military jobs. So you kind of have, they call it the Lavender Scare. So that becomes an issue. The biggest thing probably with Joseph McCarthy is he accuses the State Department of having communists in it. he says, "Oh, I have this list of names," but he never shows the list of names. And so for several years, he's like, making hay and like creating a bunch of drama. Oh, I have this list of people in this department. I have this list of people in that department. Never really saying who it was. But what they do is they call people before the committee and they drill them about, have you ever been a communist? Have you ever gone to a communist meeting? And people would rather than respond to that, having to admit that, they would just say, well, yes, and I know this person's also sympathetic. So then they would turn their attention to the other person. So there's a lot of comparisons to like the Salem witchcraft trials, where you start to avoid having to have the finger pointed at you, you point the finger at somebody else. And so Joseph McCarthy starts targeting a bunch of people. Well, it kind of comes to an end when he goes after the army. And basically, this is, in 1950s, right? 1953, Korea and World War II, and people are like, okay, that's kind of ridiculous, right? And so you really have kind of the ending of McCarthyism. And McCarthy largely, he gets censored by the Senate. He's largely disgraced, and he'll die a few years later. But you do have actual incidences of espionage. So the Red Scare is not totally uncalled for because there is a lot of espionage going on. The Rosenbergs are a famous case, that kind of talks about that. And you have, the addition of One Nation Under God, this kind of focus on Judeo-Christian beliefs and all that kind of thing, and that really kind of changes people's perceptions. So some of what we think we know about kind of our Judeo-Christian background really goes back to the Cold War, right? And so another aspect of this is going to be the military-industrial complex, where you have like this permanent kind of military institution that's part of our budget. The National Security Council Memo 68 that talks about containment and the need to have a strong military to help contain things, and our support of kind of some not very democratic people, some bad leaders all around the country. And so we start to have this shifting idea of patriotism about, do we support the military? Do we criticize the military? Particularly as Vietnam's heating up and you have lots of protests about that. There's a draft in place until 1973. Beginning then, they start the selective service registration, which is the 26th Amendment. Or not, that isn't the 26th Amendment. That's the 18-year-olds can vote. Selective service registration, where 18-year-old males have to register to vote. And 26th Amendment says 18-year-olds can have the right to vote. So those are products of kind of this domestic military-industrial complex. So that's really kind of a super fast overview of kind of the big kind of conflicts of the Cold War. And I'll touch on some of those as we look at women, but I want you to have kind of a framework. Obviously, there's a lot more details that we're not covering. Textbook goes into some more detail. If you really want to know more, you can ask me, or I can recommend really good video resources.